A single father quietly brought home an orphaned boy, thinking that love alone would be enough to start again. But during the child's first bath, he discovered a series of hidden wounds beneath the boy's clothes. What had really happened to this child before he could be called son? The landline rang in the middle of a quiet weekend afternoon, slicing through the steady silence of the small suburban house. It wasn't urgent nor persistent, just a soft call meant for someone who had grown used to stillness. In the woodworking shop behind the house, Richard Walker, in his early 40s, was bent over an old bookshelf tightening a loose bracket. The radio beside him murmured an uneventful afternoon news report about roadwork on the south end of the city and a mild nighttime chill. His hands were covered in sawdust, but Richard didn't rush. He let the phone ring a few more times before standing up, wiping his hands on a worn-out rag and slowly walking inside. He picked up the receiver, his voice deep and slightly husky. "Hello? Good afternoon, this is Patricia from the Willow Springs Children's Center. I'm happy to inform you that your adoption application has been approved." Richard fell silent for a few seconds. Each word she spoke seemed to fall slowly into the room, dragging out an old memory he had tucked away in the quiet corners of this house. It had been nearly 2 years since he submitted the application shortly after his wife had passed away from an incurable illness. A time he thought he had left behind, along with the whispered wish she had once breathed into his ear during her final days. "Really?" he asked, his breath suddenly heavy. "The boy's name is Ethan Walker. He's 6, a very special child. We've been reviewing your file for some time, and we truly believe you're the right person for him." Richard didn't respond right away. He turned toward the small picture frame sitting on the opposite shelf, a photo of his late wife. The woman with those ever-kind eyes had once held his hand on her last afternoon in the hospital and said in a voice as light as wind, "If you still know how to love a child. Don't let this house forever go without laughter." Those words had never left him, but Richard never thought he'd be able to follow through. For 2 years he lived alone between silent walls and wooden furniture no one ever used. The house was well kept, but missing something he couldn't quite name. Like standing between 2 blank walls and not knowing whether to build a window or simply let in the light. "I'll come meet the boy." This Saturday, he said firmly, and for the first time in months, he surprised even himself with the certainty in his voice. After hanging up, Richard didn't return to the shop. Instead, he walked into the living room. On the table lay the old adoption file he had once shoved into a drawer like a resignation. He took it out, placed it next to a small envelope with his wife's soft handwriting still perfectly intact. "For the day you're ready to be a father." Richard didn't open the letter. He simply placed his hand on it, closed his eyes, and stood still. Part of him still felt unready, unfit, unsure of what being a father truly meant. But deep down, something was shifting, not out of regret, but something closer to belief. He stepped out onto the porch and looked toward the small field in the distance. A sparrow perched on the railing, tilting its head as if it too was waiting for a decision. Richard smiled gently, barely audibly. Maybe it really is time for a child's voice in this house. Saturday came windless and still in Lakewood. Morning dew still clung to the windshield when Richard started his old pickup truck. The drive to Willow Springs Children's Center took about 40 minutes, but he drove slowly, not because he feared being late, but as if giving himself more time to accept that what was happening was real. The road to the center was empty. A 2-story building with pale cream-colored walls appeared behind a row of low trees. A dark wooden sign clearly read, "Willow Springs Children's Center." Richard parked, took a deep breath, and stepped through the gate. The security guard nodded and logged his name. A young staff member named Laura led him down a quiet hallway. A soft scent of soap lingered in the air. Light footsteps and the faint giggles of children echoed somewhere far off like sounds from another world. "We've carefully reviewed your file," Laura said as they walked, her voice soft, as if not wanting to disturb anyone. "Ethan is one of the quietest kids here. He doesn't act out, doesn't cause trouble, but he also rarely speaks. He's very attached to an old teddy bear, never lets go of it. We think maybe he's still waiting for something." Richard didn't reply. He simply nodded, letting his eyes wander along the drawings taped to both sides of the hallway. Brightly colored, but the subjects rarely changed Son's house's trees. Yet he noticed that some drawings had no people, only solitary trees or tightly shut doors. They stopped at the last room down the hall. Laura turned to him, her voice even lower than before. "He's inside. You can go in, but please sit at a distance. Don't try to approach him just yet." Richard nodded. Laura opened the door, then quietly stepped back. The room wasn't large. A single window allowed light to filter through faded curtains. In the far left corner on an old rug, a small boy sat curled up holding tightly to a brown teddy bear, so worn that its head slumped to one side and one arm was missing. Ethan sat facing the window, his back gently rising and falling with his breath. There was no sound except for the soft ticking of a clock in the corner. Richard took one step inside, then stopped. The boy didn't turn his head. Richard looked around, chose a spot close enough not to be threatening, and sat down. He placed a small orange ball he had brought beside him, not pushing it forward. A few minutes passed. Ethan tilted his head slightly, his eyes flicking quickly toward Richard. There was no fear, no curiosity, just the gaze of a child who had grown used to adults coming and going, not because of him, but because of something unnamed. Richard said nothing. He simply sat there quietly. Then, in a fleeting moment, Ethan pulled his bear closer and slowly turned to face Richard. Their eyes met. And strangely, neither looked away first. Maybe it was a test. Maybe it was doubt. Or maybe it was a glimmer of hope being stirred awake deep within a child who could no longer remember the last time someone truly saw him. No introductions, no words. No. In that room, the only thing that existed was silence. A silence no longer frightening, but the beginning of something entirely different. A new beginning, quiet and fragile, like the first leaf of the season, but no less real or valuable than any voice in the world. The staff member led Richard slowly down the hallway. The walls, once a bright yellow, had faded over time. Children's drawings were taped up with strips of aging tape. She stopped in front of a door, left slightly ajar. Ethan usually sits in the far corner. He doesn't act out or scream, but he rarely talks to anyone. Richard gave a slight nod, eyes focused inside. The boy was sitting on the floor, clutching a one-armed teddy bear like it was the only shield against something unnamed. The bear was worn, its fabric wrinkled, one eye torn off and replaced with crooked stitches. "Why is he afraid of being touched?" Richard asked in a low voice. The staff woman bit her lower lip gently, then shrugged, her response measured. "It could be trauma from his last placement. The records don't specify. We only received him from the county health station." He said nothing. His gaze remained fixed on the boy. Ethan was silently tapping a finger on a speck of dust on the floor as if trying to write something invisible in the air. No one dared step into that quiet world beside him. Richard stood for a long time in the children's section of the department store, feeling lost. Rows of shirts in every color, superhero prints, dinosaurs, robots, even puppies with their tongues out. He picked up a blue t-shirt with Little Champion printed on it, then put it back down. Each item seemed to ask a silent question. What would this boy like? "Can I help you find something?" a female employee approached with a professional smile. Richard looked at her as if waking from a fog. For a 6-year-old boy, what kind of shirt do they usually like? She hesitated, then gave a soft chuckle. "It depends. Some love trucks, others are into cats, but the most important thing is soft fabric, no scratchy tags on the neck. A lot of kids hate that itch." He nodded, committing every word to memory. In the end, he chose a plain sky blue shirt, a pair of soft sweatpants, fuzzy-lined slippers, a thin blanket, and a few wordless picture books. He also picked up a new teddy bear, clean and round, with even eyes and a perfect smile. But when he got home, he placed it in the drawer of the nightstand. That bear was too perfect to enter Ethan's broken world just yet. During their final meeting at the center, Richard sat across from Ethan on a bench in the backyard. The breeze whispered through the rows of pines. A dry leaf landed on the boy's knee, and he didn't bother brushing it off. "Would you like to come home with me?" Richard asked, his voice slow and careful with each word. Ethan didn't look at him. He squeezed the teddy bear's ear tightly as if asking it the question instead of himself. A minute passed, then another. Then the boy gave a small nod, barely noticeable but enough for Richard to turn his face away. His hand clenched unconsciously on his thigh, trying to hold back something on the verge of spilling out. The car moved slowly through the suburban streets of Lakewood where Richard lived. Ethan didn't ask anything, didn't look out the window. He just held the bear tighter and tilted his head slightly when the car turned left. When they reached the house, Richard didn't speak right away. He opened the door and pointed to each area as if inviting a young guest into a world no one had lived in before. "This is the kitchen. You'll be able to smell fresh muffins in the morning from here. This is my study. But if you like reading, you're welcome here too." They stopped at the backyard, where a few small pots lined a bare patch of earth. "This can be your garden. You can plant whatever you want." Ethan stared at the soil for a while. He tightened his grip on the bear, then nodded. Just once. For the first dinner, Richard placed a slice of toast, a cup of warm milk, and a small bowl of chia seeds on the table. Ethan ate only the toast and drank half the milk. When Richard offered the chia bowl, the boy shook his head. Then, unexpectedly, he tugged up the collar of his shirt, not because he was cold, but as if to hide something. Richard didn't ask. He simply nodded and placed a folded napkin on the table as if to say, "It's okay." The bedroom had been carefully prepared. The wallpaper had soft star patterns, and a moon-shaped nightlight hung from the headboard corner. The sheets were printed with calming fern leaves. A few gentle comic books sat on the shelf. A small bronze bell was placed by the pillow. "If you don't want to call out loud, just ring this, I'll hear you." Ethan didn't respond, but before lying down, he gently placed the teddy bear beside him, as if letting it hear the message too. At midnight, the house was quiet. Richard lay on the couch in the living room, eyes shut but not yet asleep. A soft ding-ling sounded not loud, just enough to stir a father newly learning the rhythm of parenthood. He got up quickly, stepping quietly to the next room. The door was still ajar. Ethan lay facing the wall, his eyes wide open, silent. Only when he saw Richard step inside did his eyelids blink, then slowly close. Richard didn't come closer. He simply sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting on his lap, waiting patiently. Ethan didn't cry, didn't call out. His breathing slowly evened. Under the warm yellow glow of the nightlight, the room became still, as if even time had paused to listen. Richard stood up, turned toward the door. As his hand touched the knob, a whisper so faint it nearly dissolved into the air rose behind him. "Thank you, Dad." He froze, didn't turn back, didn't say a word. Just stood there in the doorway, realizing his heart no longer felt as empty as before. Something had begun to grow quietly but surely, like a seed sprouting from soil that had been dry for far too long. Ethan didn't cry. He didn't scream or say much at all. But some mornings Richard would wake up and see the boy's wide-open eyes staring into the dark, his gaze drifting as if he were somewhere far away. Not in their quiet suburban home in Lakewood, but in another place altogether cold, confined, where fear didn't need words to survive. Richard started noticing the little things. When he accidentally dropped a spoon in the kitchen, the sharp clang of metal on tile made Ethan flinch and back against the wall, clutching his ragged teddy bear so tightly it nearly collapsed in his grip. Once the washing machine kicked into a loud spin cycle, and Ethan immediately abandoned his meal, ducking under the table as if his life depended on it. No one teaches a 6-year-old to react like that. That's memory. Every time Richard approached with a coat to help the boy warm up, Ethan would shrink his shoulders and lower his head as if expecting a blow to the back of his neck. After the first time, Richard witnessed that he stopped trying to dress him. Instead, he would place the coat gently on the arm of the chair and wait, watching as Ethan quietly slipped it on without ever meeting his eyes. Richard no longer slept soundly. Night sounds made him listen, not out of fear of burglars, but fear of choked sobs, the kind that catch in the throat of a child who has no name for pain. One evening, colder than usual, Ethan sat in his small study room, paint scattered across the table. The bold black strokes on the paper looked as though they had been pressed down with an angry hand. Richard stood at the door and knocked softly 3 times. No answer. "Ethan, would you like a bath? I'll warm the water for you, just for a few minutes." No response. The boy kept his back turned. But after a few seconds, he stood up suddenly. His shoulders trembled. He hugged the teddy bear tightly, eyes wide, lips quivering. "No, I've been good. I don't need a bath. I'll get hit. Please don't." The words broke like wind slipping through a narrow gap in the doorframe. Richard froze. Ethan began backing up toward the wall, his small frame pressing into the unfinished painting behind him, where streaks of red looked like dried blood on white paper. His eyes didn't show fear, they showed panic, as if Richard had become someone else entirely, someone whose mere gesture could erase him. "I won't make you," Richard whispered, his voice barely louder than a breath. "I was just afraid you might be cold." The silence returned. Only the ticking of the wall clock remained. Richard slowly sat down on the floor, leaving a few feet between them. "You don't have to do anything. I just thought a warm bath might help you sleep better. But if you don't want to, I won't mention it again." Ethan said nothing. He turned his face to the wall and sank down onto the floor. Richard stood up quietly, exited the room, and before closing the door, he placed a mug of hot cocoa on the small shelf near the hallway where the warm light cast a gentle glow on the white wall. The door closed. A breeze tapped faintly at the porch window. Richard passed the photo hanging in the living room, the one of him and his late wife standing beneath a row of sunflowers in Sunridge Fields. He stopped and stared into the eyes that had once been his light. She was gone, but she'd left behind a promise he was still struggling to keep. Be a father, not just on paper, but with your heart. He stepped out onto the balcony and pulled out his phone. He dialed. Emily's voice came through after one ring. "Emily, I'm sorry to call so late. I'm still up. How's Ethan?" Richard sat down, pressing his hand against his forehead. He's afraid of baths, not the water itself, but something behind the sound. Every time he hears the washing machine or running water, he hides, like he's been drowned. There was a pause on the other end. Then Emily's voice dropped low. "I once reviewed the medical file of a girl from the same center. She reacted the same way. They wrote down panic of unknown origin. But that's just a way of hiding what they didn't want to write." "You think he was tortured during bath time?" "I can't say for sure," Emily replied, "but it looks like it." Richard sighed. "I don't even know where to start. I don't want to hurt him, but if I leave it alone, I'm afraid he'll never live a normal life." Emily was silent for a while before saying gently, "Richard, you're doing the right thing. Go slow. Don't make him call you dad. Don't ask for love. Just be there and wait for him to come to you." He hung up, letting the black screen reflect a face that had aged in ways only sorrow understands. Outside, the curtain on the ground floor swayed in the wind. The hallway light remained on. Midnight. Richard opened his eyes to the soft rustle of fabric. He stepped out of his room and walked down the hallway. The light was still on. The cocoa was cold, the moisture leaving a ring on the wooden shelf. He gently opened Ethan's door. The boy was asleep, but not peacefully. His body twisted under the blanket, his face scrunched tight, sweat beading on his forehead. His arms clutched the teddy bear lips, twitching soundlessly as if pleading for something inside a nightmare. Richard didn't call out. He just walked over, dragged a small chair to the bedside, and sat down. He rested his hands on his knees and watched the boy's tense face. His heart sank, not out of fear, but helplessness. A 6-year-old shouldn't know how to brace for a blow, shouldn't know how to dodge the sound of a washing machine. After a few minutes, he gently leaned back along the edge of the bed, careful not to touch the boy. He lay there, eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, letting his breath move in steady rhythm like a silent knock that asked nothing. "I'm here," he whispered. "No one can hurt you anymore, not even me if you're not ready." Ethan didn't wake, but his breathing slowed. His grip on the teddy bear softened. The lines on his face eased as though those quiet words had slipped into his dream. Outside the window, the stars above the Oregon Highlands drifted in silence. No one said a word. But in a small room, two souls were learning how to stay, not through speech, but through the tender patience of a father. Richard could no longer count the times he had told himself to be patient, but deep down he knew it had never really been about patience. What kept him waiting again and again was the simple fact that Ethan wasn't ready to step out of his cocoon of fear. In the small kitchen, Richard lifted his hand from the still warm cup of tea. He heard light footsteps running across the yard. Through the slightly open window, he saw Ethan playing with a bright orange toy truck, the kind kids usually love. The boy pulled it along with a string, then stepped back to observe, then pulled again. No smile, no words. But at least he was no longer hiding in the corner of the room. Richard said nothing. He just watched as if trying to memorize every small movement the boy made. Maybe he was afraid. afraid he'd miss something important if he happened to look away. The air inside the house was as heavy as it feels right before a storm. The air conditioning was on, but it did little to push back the thick warmth of early summer. Richard stood up and slowly walked down the hallway. When he saw Ethan coming back inside, cheeks flushed and smudged with dirt, he spoke in a calm, everyday tone. "Ethan, it's hot today. I've got warm water ready. Would you like to take a bath?" The moment the question left his lips, the boy's small shoulders tensed. Ethan quickly shook his head and avoided Richard's eyes. He wrapped his arms around his stomach and stepped closer to the wall as if trying to find shelter. Richard didn't come any closer. He sat down on the wooden chair nearby, making sure his voice carried no pressure. "It's all right. If you're not ready, there's no need to take a bath," he said, leaning over to grab a book left by the window. Ethan stayed still. After a while, he spoke so softly that Richard almost didn't hear it. "They made me bathe in cold water. If I shivered, they'd hit my hand with a metal spoon." The sentence ended like a blade pulled too fast. Richard set the book down. He turned his head and caught Ethan's eyes for a brief moment. But those weren't the eyes of a 6-year-old. They were eyes that had learned to endure, eyes that had learned to keep quiet because they knew some pain couldn't be screamed out loud. "No one will ever do that to you here," Richard said, word by word slowly. "I promise. Bath time is only when you feel safe. No one forces you to do anything here." Ethan didn't reply. But he didn't look away either. His gaze grew still, as if he were truly listening or trying to decide whether he could believe that. As the clock ticked into a new hour, Richard was watering the plants when he heard quick steps coming from the porch. Ethan stood at the doorway, face streaked with dirt, his green t-shirt covered in mud, a small scrape on his elbow. His hand still clutched the string attached to the toy truck. His eyes were slightly red, like he was on the verge of crying, but his lips were tight and there was a mixture of shyness and defiance in his gaze. "Did you fall?" Richard asked as he walked over. Ethan gave a small nod, then glanced down at his dirty shirt. He looked up, hesitating. "If you just sit by the door, not come in, then I'll try." Richard didn't ask anything more. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and nodded. "I understand. I'll stay outside. The towel and warm water are ready." The bathroom door closed behind Ethan with a soft creak. Richard sat down on the porch step holding a glass of water, feeling something he couldn't name. It wasn't exactly nerves nor worry. It was more like standing in front of a door that had been locked for years now, waiting for the person inside to open it just a little. Time passed slowly. No sound of running water. Only the faint shuffle of a plastic basin and the occasional soft sigh leaking through the cracks. Richard didn't knock or call. He just sat there still as a stone so Ethan would know he was truly waiting not for cleanliness, but for trust. Nearly half an hour later, the door opened. Ethan came out still wearing his dirty shirt. His cheek was still smeared with mud and drops of water clung to his hair. He stood still for a few seconds, then said, "Can you help me take my shirt off?" Richard answered gently, "Of course I can help you." As soon as Richard touched his shoulder, Ethan burst into tears. "Dad, it hurts. It hurts." Richard froze, then quickly helped lift the shirt to see what had caused such pain. And when his eyes landed on the boy's bare back, he stopped. No one could have been prepared for that. The small back no longer bore the smooth skin of a child. It was covered in faded welts, crisscrossing scars, old and new bruises blending together. Under the left shoulder blade, a dark patch of skin shaped like a misshapen circle burned by something metal. Richard couldn't hold back his words. "Ethan, who did this to you?" The boy lowered his head. His hand let go of the shirt. Tears slid from his eyes without a single sob. "I don't remember clearly. Just a dark closet and ropes." Richard didn't ask again. He turned away, eyes fixed on the empty window where the afternoon light filtered through the blinds. "The towel is on the chair," he said, voice nearly a whisper. "Don't forget to dry your hair." While Ethan napped that afternoon, Richard quietly stepped into the storage room and opened an old drawer. He took out a small wooden box. Inside were blank sheets of paper, colored pens, and a few pencils. On the lid, faded words were carved, "For dreams." That evening, Richard placed the box on the kitchen table without a word. He simply slid it toward Ethan. No invitation, no expectations. Ethan sat still. Then he pulled out the first sheet, grabbed a black pen, and began drawing very slowly. Only after Richard finished washing the dishes did Ethan walk over with the paper. He didn't speak, just handed it over. A small room with no windows. From the ceiling, a chain. In the center, a faceless figure holding a rope. At the bottom corner, a clumsy scrawl, C2. Richard stared at it for a long time. No questions. No reaction. He simply placed a hand gently on Ethan's shoulder. The next morning, Richard drove to Dr. Emily Carter's clinic. Ethan sat quietly in the back seat, hugging his torn teddy bear eyes, staring outside without really seeing anything. When Dr. Carter examined the marks, she only shook her head. She didn't speak right away. Only when Ethan had left the room did she look at Richard's voice, calm but firm. "These aren't accidents, and they didn't happen just once." Richard clenched his hands on his knees, then looked through the glass. In the waiting room, Ethan sat on a little green plastic chair. The one-armed teddy bear rested in his lap. He swung his legs gently, quiet, like a candle no one noticed. Richard didn't say a word. One thought repeated in his mind. What did you go through in that dark closet they called C2? The next morning, Richard drove Ethan to Grace Thompson's studio. The boy's small hand rested on Richard's elbow the entire way. He didn't cling, didn't tremble, didn't speak. But something in his silent presence made Richard feel as if he were holding a bird that had lost one wing. There was no music in the car, no small talk between them. The drive unfolded in silence, stretched thin like they were entering a space where language no longer served its purpose, and only their shared presence kept the world from collapsing. The studio was tucked away on an old street in Lakewood, where the paint on the little houses still clung to the past few decades. Richard stopped the truck and walked around to open Ethan's door. The boy looked up at the wooden sign hanging over the gate, Therapeutic Art Space. No cheerful drawings, no bright colors, just the name as if quietly declaring that no coaxing was needed here and nothing would be forced. Grace opened the door. She was in her 50s, gray-streaked hair tied neatly, dark eyes, steady but without judgment. She didn't crouch down to greet Ethan. She simply tilted her head slightly and said in a calm, even voice, "Hi there. You don't have to do anything here. Just be. If you want to sit quietly, that's okay. If you want to draw, there's paper. And if you want to tear it up, that's okay too." Ethan didn't respond, but his eyes brushed past hers for a moment before looking away. The art room had no plastic chairs, no blackboards, no projectors. A soft rug covered the floor. Along the walls, 3 low shelves were filled with pencils, crayons, watercolor paint, clay, charcoal sticks, paper of every size, and thin pieces of wood for mounting. In one corner sat cushions, a water bottle, paper towels, and a box of tissues. Everything was neat, accessible, and calm, not clinical. Grace didn't rush anything. She guided Richard to a small chair in the corner and let Ethan sit nearby. Then she moved to her work table and began washing brushes from the previous session. The atmosphere in the room seemed to breathe, built not of words but of quiet warmth and non-intrusion. Almost 10 minutes passed without a sound. Then Ethan stood and walked over to the left shelf. He picked up a box of crayons, turning each one slowly. He didn't take the whole box, just 3 colors, black, red, and gray. The first sheet of paper lay flat. He used the black crayon to draw a square, then divided it into 4 smaller overlapping squares. No windows, no people. Just a space, heavy and layered so deeply the pressure tore a small corner of the page. On the second page, Ethan drew a rectangle. Near the edge was a small door placed unusually high close to the ceiling. Inside the room was a long stick mounted on the wall. This time he added a figure, no eyes, no mouth, no hands. He repeated the shape 7 times, overlapping them like shadows. Grace silently slid another sheet of paper toward him. On the third, Ethan used all 3 colors. He drew a narrow tunnel stretching from the corner of the page to its edge. At the end of it was a hand reaching out, fingers thin and long, but no arm attached. No background, only the image and the emptiness. Grace didn't interrupt. She simply observed, taking brief notes on a small pad. Every so often, her eyes met Richard's across the room, but neither of them spoke. In that silence, things became clearer than words ever could. Emily arrived around noon carrying an old case file in a brown envelope. She wasn't wearing her white coat, just a long overcoat, her hair tied back. Richard stepped out of the studio so they could speak privately. "When I used to work at the North County Health Station," Emily began as they sat across a small tea table. "4 children were transferred to us over 3 years. All of them came from Willow Springs Children's Center." She pulled out 4 black and white photos showing children's bodies marked with burns shaped like circles, bruises in repeated patterns, ribs slightly displaced. The files all said they fell or injured themselves while sleepwalking. But the placement and shapes of the wounds were always the same. Grace said nothing at first. She read each report carefully. Then she closed the folder, resting her hand on the edge of the table, her thumb lightly holding the cover. "These aren't accidents. And it's no coincidence." She began describing what she had observed in Ethan's artwork. His color choices, the repetitive structures, the faceless human shapes, the haunting recurrence of doors placed in unreachable spaces. "This is what repressed memory looks like. It doesn't come out in words. It comes out in form, especially when no one was there to listen when the trauma first happened." The room on the other side remained silent. Ethan was still drawing, this time with black charcoal. Richard stayed where he was, eyes fixed on the boy. When Grace returned to the room, she placed a fresh blank sheet on the rug without a word. Ethan looked up, his gaze skimming across her face, then settling on the window. He spoke very softly. "In there was no smell, no sound, just a shadow, walking back and forth. It just walked, never looked at anyone." Richard looked at his son. He tightened his fists but didn't speak. As dusk fell, they gathered their things. Just before stepping outside, Grace leaned down slightly and spoke to Richard in a voice barely above a whisper. "He's not making it up. This is memory. And that," she paused, weighing the words, "wasn't just a room. It was a place of torture." Richard gently closed the door, his hand still carrying the warmth from Ethan's shoulder after walking him to his room. He told himself to keep a calm expression as he left the house, but inside the conflict was growing stronger by the minute. Deep in his gut was the sick feeling of a father who could no longer look away, and ahead of him stood the iron gate of Willow Springs Children's Center, where every step was marked with doubt. No one greeted him in the lobby. The receptionist barely glanced up before returning to her screen, fingers tapping away as if Richard were just another delivery man dropping off a package. He walked straight down the main hallway, past crooked picture frames peeling paint, and the sharp, familiar smell of antiseptic mingled with old paper choking the breath from his chest. Mr. Gregory Baldwin sat behind his desk, top button of his shirt, undone hands folded like a man who had been waiting. No files were open, only a cold ceramic mug that had long since gone cold. His eyes never left Richard, but they held no life in them. Richard didn't sit. He looked directly at the man in front of him and kept his voice steady. "I came because I have the right to know. What did Ethan endure here? Who is responsible?" Baldwin didn't answer right away. He leaned back slowly, arms crossed, his eyes bordering on bored. "There are a lot of things you don't understand about how we operate," he said smoothly, without a hint of emotion. "And it's best you don't dig too deep. This place isn't for dreamers." Richard gripped the handle of his bag tighter, fire rising in his chest, but he held it back. "I'm not here to dream. I'm here for the truth." Baldwin stood up at last and moved toward the window behind him, staring out at a dried-up courtyard. "The truth is," he continued, "if you insist on pursuing this, the one who gets hurt won't be me." Richard walked out of the center with a chill crawling up the back of his neck. On the drive home, he didn't turn on the radio, didn't touch the heater, didn't call anyone. That night, when the house had gone still, the phone rang like a blade slicing through the calm. "If you want that kid to stay safe, stop asking questions." The man's voice was dry, and he didn't speak again. Richard froze beside the kitchen table, his grip on the phone so tight his knuckles turned white. All night he checked every lock, every window. But in the morning, when he walked into the garage, he found the lock broken. Nothing was missing, but a red slip of paper was taped to the wall with a single scrawled message: "Those who know too much don't live long." He removed the note carefully, making sure not to leave fingerprints. He placed it in a drawer next to the USB drive containing copies of Ethan's drawings. In that moment, he had already made up his mind. Later that afternoon, Grace Thompson arrived at the door carrying a fresh box of paints, several large sheets of drawing paper, and an old leather-bound sketchbook. She said nothing about the garage, nothing about the phone call. She simply said, "It's time to let the boy speak in his own way." They set up the easel in the corner of the living room. At first, Ethan just stood there watching. Then, as if something unseen urged him forward, he walked to the chair and sat down. Richard remained nearby, but didn't interfere. Grace gave no instructions, no suggestions. She simply said, "Today, you can draw anything. We'll keep it all. This is your journal in color." The first page was covered in tangled black lines with no clear shape. Ethan paused often as though wrestling with memories too deep for words. Richard didn't step in. Grace only nodded softly. The second page revealed a clearer image, a metal door with no handle, a dim ceiling light. The third page contained one haunting detail, C2, scrawled in the corner. Richard felt his heart drop as Ethan continued drawing. His small hand trembled, but he didn't stop. This time he drew an empty metal bed and a faceless figure standing with its back turned. The fourth drawing showed two boys standing side by side, no mouths, blank eyes. One had curly hair, the other raised a hand as if waving goodbye. "Who are you drawing?" Grace asked gently. Ethan didn't look up. His voice was barely a whisper. "Noah. He used to sleep in the bed by the wall. One night, they called his name over the speaker. He promised he'd come back, but he never did." Richard was silent. He wanted to ask more, but Grace placed her hand gently on his shoulder and shook her head. They stayed quiet so Ethan could continue. He picked up the red crayon and colored the frame of the C2 room, then quietly folded the paper. After Ethan had gone upstairs, Richard sat alone. In front of him was the final drawing. Two children in a windowless room, chains hanging from the ceiling. A faceless figure stood outside the barred door watching. Richard leaned forward, pressing his elbows to the table and burying his face in his hands. He didn't cry, but his breath came in broken waves. The room was silent, filled only with the faint scent of watercolor and the soft yellow glow of the lamplight that landed on a man's eyes the moment he finally admitted that this would not be a simple fight. The computer screen still glowed faintly, its cold light reflecting on Richard Walker's hollow cheekbones. He hadn't slept all night. Something deep in his chest wouldn't let him lie down, wouldn't let him feel at ease. Ethan had fallen asleep hours ago, curled up beside the window with his one-armed teddy bear, where the moonlight poured in like a quiet stream of memory. Richard sat there, hand resting on the keyboard, but he hadn't typed a single word. A familiar hesitation wrapped around him, fear of sounding too emotional, fear of being dismissed. Fear that his words would help no one except the fury burning inside him. And yet if he said nothing, he knew he would live the rest of his life trapped in helplessness. He took a deep breath and opened the archive folder. The photos of Ethan's injuries ripped through his last shred of composure. There was no need for introductions, no need for explanations. Richard let the words spill straight from his chest, his gut from a pain that had never truly healed. "I'm not a social activist. I'm not a good writer. I'm just a father, and I saw something I can't ignore." He didn't write in order. He wrote as the emotions came. "Ethan, my son, was once tied up, abused, and labeled as unfit to live in a family environment. He doesn't speak much, but every one of his drawings is a memory. A room named C2, a faceless man, a rope hanging from the ceiling." He attached images, Ethan's drawings, the medical report confirmed by Dr. Emily Carter, and an audio clip of Ethan whispering about Noah, the friend who was taken away and never came back. Finally, he wrote, "If I stay silent, I don't deserve to be the father of any child. No drama, no bold font, no need for anyone's approval." He clicked post. At first, nothing happened. Everything remained still like water before a storm. Richard got up and made a cup of coffee, but didn't drink it. He stared out the window. Ethan was still asleep. An hour later, his phone buzzed with short, then continuous vibrations. A friend in media messaged him, "You just started a fire. The hashtag Justice for Ethan is trending. Only 45 minutes in." The post spread faster than anyone could have expected. People shared it, leaving hundreds of comments. "I used to work there, and I knew something was wrong. My child was almost rejected for being too sensitive. Don't let this be buried." Richard didn't read them all. He walked back to Ethan's room, pulled the blanket over him gently, then stepped outside. In the pale dawn light, he saw a tiny sunflower sprout pushing up through the soil, fragile but real. By midday, a local news station reached out. "We'd like to run a feature. Can we interview you this afternoon?" Richard declined. He sent them the entire post, images and evidence, with a single request. "Keep my words exactly as they are. Don't rewrite anything." That evening, the program Voices of Truth aired a special segment. The images were shown without blurring a crude drawing. A room labeled C2, a faceless man standing next to a hanging strap. The narrator didn't comment. "Just read aloud," my child said. "I don't deserve to live with anyone. I was beaten because I didn't know how to smile." Each line landed like a blow to the viewers' hearts. The next morning, Richard received a strange email. The subject line read, "We knew, but we were forced to stay silent." It was signed Alexander Rivas, former accountant at Willow Springs Children's Center. In the letter, he explained that years ago he had seen multiple files marked unfit for family placement, then watched them disappear from the system. "I saved backup copies before I resigned. Not because I was brave, because I couldn't sleep at night." Alexander offered to meet in person to hand over the materials. Richard replied, "I'll be there. My attorney will come with me." The cafe where they met sat tucked behind a small market under the lavender canopy of jacaranda trees. Michael Green was already waiting in an earth-toned shirt, his eyes both cold and alert. Richard entered with nothing but a notebook and a steady gaze. They shook hands in silence as if everything had already been said. Alexander arrived last. His posture was slightly hunched, his skin weathered by the sun, but his eyes were sharp. He carried an old leather briefcase which he placed gently on the table and opened slowly like a ritual. "These are printed backups of every removed file," he said. "They all have one thing in common. They were labeled as disruptive, emotionally unstable, or hard to adapt. But I know they just didn't want them to be adopted." The documents were covered in red stamps, scribbled notes, some pages erased and overwritten. Several had photos of children, their frightened faces far too young. Michael flipped through them, taking quick notes in pencil. He spoke softly. "If what you're saying is true, this points to destruction of evidence. We could request a cross-agency investigation." Alexander nodded slightly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want someone brave enough to look at these papers and not turn away." That evening, the news replayed a clip of Gregory Baldwin walking out of Willow Springs Children's Center, heading quickly toward a car. The camera lights hit him square in the face. A young reporter raised a microphone. "What's your response to the accusations made by Richard Walker?" Baldwin paused, adjusted his collar, and turned to the lens. His tone was flat. "Kids have vivid imaginations. Nothing illegal happened here." Richard watched the segment from home, fists clenched. But this time, Baldwin's smile had no effect. Social media erupted in outrage. Child protection organizations began to speak out. One commentator called Richard's post the push needed to expose a rotten system. Ethan was in his room, his hands smeared with orange and yellow paint. He was drawing a field. There was no room C2, no shadows, only sunlight. No one said a word during the long drive up the winding gravel roads leading toward Mount Cedar. Michael gripped a folded piece of paper with frayed edges while Richard held the steering wheel tighter than necessary. They both knew that finding the missing children wasn't like winning a battle. There would be no cheers, no medals, no triumphant music, only a silence so cold it cut through bone mixed with a deep unease too raw to name. The anonymous tip had included nothing but coordinates and a scrawled note, "Still alive. Not much longer." Below it, the final sentence was written with a heavier hand, as if the writer had pressed down harder on purpose. The truck turned onto a narrow trail covered in wild grass swaying gently in the breeze. No houses, no road signs, just a faint tire track stretched across the damp earth. As the sparse forest opened up into a shallow valley, a small wooden cabin came into view, looking like a sloppy patch stitched into the wilderness. The roof slanted sharply. The wooden door was ajar, and a flickering oil lamp inside cast a quiet amber glow through a torn curtain. Richard stepped out first. Michael didn't speak, but his eyes followed every step his friend took. No one dared call out. Richard simply placed his hand on the door, then drew it back as if shocked, not from fear, but from the terror of not seeing what he came for, or worse, seeing something broken beyond repair. "Is Noah Evans, Liam Brooks, here?" Richard called, his voice low and dry. There was a pause so deep they could hear the wind pushing through the cracks in the walls. Then a whisper came. "Are you Mateo's dad?" Richard held his breath. The door opened. A wave of must-cold ash and mildew hit his face, but he didn't flinch. Standing before him were 5 children, all of them painfully thin, their faces streaked with dirt, hair tangled in matted clumps. Their clothes hung loose, stained and worn, barefoot eyes, hollow from hunger and sleeplessness. None of them cried. They simply stared at him, dazed and guarded, as if trying to decide whether this was a dream they could trust. The smallest one clutched an empty sardine can to his chest, eyes glittering. Noah stepped forward first, his gaze locked on Richard. "Mateo said you were a good man. He said if anyone would come back, it would be you." Richard could no longer hold himself together. He crouched down, arms open. Noah hesitated a second, then ran into his embrace. The others followed more slowly, but they came. In moments, he held all 5 of them, trembling, as if afraid letting go would make them disappear again. "No one's going to take you away ever again." "I promise," Richard whispered. Michael stepped inside and began inspecting every corner. A cold charcoal stove, some moldy bread rolls, a filthy scrap of blanket, and a notebook hidden beneath a loose floorboard. He opened it. The handwriting was crude and difficult to read, but legible enough. Name Noah Holding, compliant, Liam, keep easy to train. Red markings crossed some lines, including, "Cries too much, requires sedation." Michael said nothing. He handed the notebook to Richard. Richard bit his lips so hard it bled. He didn't need to ask what horrors had occurred in that place. The trip back wasn't easy. The children were too exhausted to speak. Richard let them sleep, their heads leaning against each other in the back seat, while Michael called the local child welfare agency, requesting immediate intervention. At the community health clinic, doctors conducted initial evaluations. No severe injuries, but all 5 children were severely malnourished. One of them showed signs of anemia and was hooked up to an IV right away. A female nurse fought back tears when she saw the flat belly of the smallest girl. Richard signed the intake report. Each stroke of the pen felt like carving through the years someone had spent destroying these children. That night, Richard and Michael returned to Lakewood with full evidence. A judge signed the search and arrest warrant for Margaret Sloan at dawn. She was apprehended at her home without resistance. She brushed her shoulder off, then looked straight into the news camera like someone far too familiar with spotlights. "So it's all because of those kids," she muttered with a cold smirk as the handcuffs snapped shut. They should have kept their mouths shut. No one replied. Richard barely looked at her. She was just a fading nightmare he didn't want to carry into memory. When the truck pulled up to the gate, Ethan was already there holding a watering can. His clothes streaked with soil, hair, tousled face lit up with joy. He didn't wait for the door to open. The moment he saw Noah climb down, first, Ethan dropped the can and ran to the gate. Ethan, Noah. There were no words for reunions like this. They threw themselves into each other's arms, rolled across the grass, laughing. The laughter burst like a balloon finally released after days and days of pressure. Richard stood watching, feeling a weight lift from his chest he hadn't realized he'd carried for so long. Ethan turned, his eyes shining, and stopped in front of Richard. "I'm not scared of baths anymore." Richard didn't respond. He simply smiled, placed a hand on the boy's head, and pulled him into an embrace. This time, Ethan didn't flinch or freeze. He gently leaned into his father's chest and let out a long, quiet sigh, as if he was finally breathing for real. In the garden out back, sunflowers had just begun to bloom. From afar, Michael raised his hand in a quiet wave, his gaze lingering on each child's face longer than usual. No one needed to say anything else, not because the story was over, but because from that moment on, something else had truly begun. Everything unfolded more quietly than Richard had expected. There were no drums, no applause, no papers fluttering in the air like some movie finale. The courtroom held a simple row of tables, neatly stacked forms, and the sound of a pen signing paper rang out sharp as a blade, slicing through a thin sheet of wood. Michael was the first to receive the official decree. He read it carefully, then turned to Richard and gave him a short nod. "No embellishment, none needed." "Congratulations," he said, handing over the signed paper. "As of today, your son has a legal father. But we both know that started a long time ago." Richard held the document in his hand, his eyes lingering on the name Ethan Walker, placed neatly above the words permanent guardianship. He had imagined this moment so many times, But now all he could do was sit still holding the paper without trembling, without crying, without even breathing heavily. It felt like a rope had finally been loosened from around his chest. "Michael," he said slowly, "you know when my wife was still alive, we talked about adopting, but after she passed, I thought I'd never be able to finish anything again." Michael didn't interrupt. He just sat there looking at his friend. And then Ethan came along bringing not just a name but a wound I couldn't have imagined. I didn't know where to start, had nothing to prove I was worthy, but he stayed. He didn't talk much, didn't smile right away, but he never left. "Just like you." Michael smiled. "You never gave up." Grace chose a small room at the corner of the center to hold the first group therapy session. There was nothing fancy, just a few tables, a rack of paints, and a round rug spread out on the floor. The children came in one by one, all carrying the same quiet expression, their eyes seeming to see through people rather than at them. Ethan stood near the door, holding a box of colored pencils, the lid still closed. He hesitated, looking in, watching other kids already seated on the rug. One was drawing a cat, another a tree. One child just sat there, slowly turning the tip of a pencil as if sharpening old memories. Grace didn't push. She walked gently over and asked softly, "You can sit anywhere you like. You don't have to draw until you're ready." Ethan said nothing, but as if drawn into that silent space where no one was judging, he stepped forward and sat down near the window. His first sheet of paper stayed blank for 10 minutes. Then light blue lines began to appear. A sky emerged, simple but bright, with small purple clouds, and beneath them 2 figures, one tall, one small, stood together on a patch of land. Grace didn't ask what it meant. She simply placed a yellow crayon close to his hand. Ethan added a sunflower next to the smaller figure's feet. "My friend's name is Lily," he said as Grace sat beside him. She didn't say anything else. "They said she was leftover," he continued. "No one picked her because she wasn't cute. She didn't smile when people visited, didn't say polite things, but she could sing lullabies. Once baby Samuel wouldn't stop crying and no one could calm him. Lily just sat beside him, gently patting his back, and sang. Her voice was soft like wind." "Do you know why people didn't see that?" Grace asked, almost in a whisper. Ethan shook his head. "Because they came looking for the brightest things, but sometimes light hides in places no one thinks to look." The boy didn't respond, but his face grew stiller. The community gathering took place in a small center on the north side of town. Richard hadn't prepared a speech. He wore a plain shirt and stood among older adults, people who had once been denied the chance to adopt, who had signed paperwork but never received an answer. One woman held up a stack of old documents, her voice shaking as she spoke of a child she had seen only once and never got another chance. Richard didn't make promises. He didn't talk about evidence or name those responsible. He simply spoke about the first time Ethan stepped into his home, sat on the edge of the bed, unsure if he should take off his shoes. He told them about the night Ethan called him Dad without using his mouth. "I'm no one special," he said in a steady, low voice. "Just an adult who once feared not being good enough. But if someone gives you a look and you don't turn away, maybe that's the start of doing something right." A man stood up, holding his wife's hand. He looked around the room and said softly, "We're not alone, and neither are our children." Ethan sat by the window, chin resting in his hand. He looked out at the patch of earth behind the house where Richard had just finished building a low wooden fence around the young trees they had planted. Some of the saplings leaned awkwardly, their leaves still sparse, but their soft green color was enough to soothe the heart. When Richard stepped into the room, the boy turned and held out a piece of paper. It showed a room from his memories, room C2, but this time the door was open and sunlight poured in from the outside. "I dreamed I walked out of there," Ethan said. "Someone was waiting outside. Did they have a face?" Richard asked. The boy nodded. "It was you." Richard tightened his hand around the boy's smaller one. They stepped out into the yard, walking between the rows of new trees. A breeze swept through Ethan's hair. He pointed at a tree taller than the others. "That one's for Lily," he said. "If she ever comes, I want her to see it first." Richard bent down, adjusting the soil around the roots. "You're not someone who has to be hidden anymore," he whispered. Ethan didn't answer. He simply leaned his head against Richard's arm. "You're the light." Every time Ethan pressed his small hand into the soil, Richard gently dropped a seed into the little hollow he had just made. They didn't say anything at first, only exchanged a brief nod and kept working with the quiet patience of two people rebuilding something that had once been broken. Ethan lightly scraped the dirt with the back of his hand. Fresh mud clung to the cuffs of his shirt, but he didn't mind. Beside him, Richard carefully planted a small wooden stick into each spot. Each stick held a piece of recycled paper with a name written on it. There was Noah, Liam, Samuel, and then Lily. The handwriting leaned slightly even and pale blue on the paper. The names seemed to rise from the ground, no longer just memories, but a living presence in the garden behind the small house. "Dad, what if someone doesn't remember their name?" Ethan asked, eyes fixed on the space between two saplings. Richard placed a hand gently on the boy's back. "Then we'll plant another tree. The ones who can't say their names yet still deserve to be remembered." The air wasn't joyful, nor was it exactly sad. It was still just enough to hear the quiet crackle of soil under their fingers. With each scoop, it felt like they were digging through a sliver of time. But this time, instead of wounds, they were planting life. While they were packing up their tools, Richard's phone buzzed. A message from Michael. "Don't forget the recognition ceremony this evening. Ethan's the final speaker." Inside the room had already been set up. Ethan stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his collar. The white shirt was a bit too big but had been carefully ironed. He looked at himself for a long time, as if trying to recognize the boy in the reflection. Richard stood behind him, making no corrections. He knew Ethan was doing it his own way. At the small town square where the city hall stood, rows of plain chairs had been arranged beneath a white canopy. In front, a wooden podium draped with a beige cloth stood under soft sunlight, filtering through the fabric, highlighting the worn scratches on its surface. The atmosphere felt more like a community gathering than an award ceremony. The host's voice echoed steadily, naming individuals and organizations who had contributed to the investigation that had stretched for over half a year. Short applause, polite handshakes, a few quick photos. Richard stood backstage, one hand in his pocket, eyes fixed on the chair where his son sat. When it was Ethan's turn, he stood slowly walking, as if on a tightrope between nerves and bravery. At the microphone, he paused for a few seconds to gather himself. The crowd was quiet, not rushing him. The silence seemed to hold him up. "My name is Ethan." His voice trembled slightly. "I used to live in a room with no windows, but now I have a dad, and I know there's light out there." He paused, took a deep breath. "Thank you, Dad, for believing in me even when I couldn't find the words." Richard's hand tightened, his chest constricted. In his eyes, the boy standing there was no longer the timid child who once sat curled in a corner at the center. He was a survivor, a witness, a voice for those who couldn't speak. As the event ended and people began to leave in quiet order, Richard was packing up his bag when a middle-aged woman approached him. Her face was sun-worn hair, neatly tied back, though a few silver strands had slipped forward. She stood silently for a moment, then spoke in a husky voice. "My name is Emily. I was forced to sign a paper giving up custody of my daughter because I couldn't contribute to the center." Richard looked at her but said nothing. She continued, "They took my little girl. I don't know where she is, but what you've done has given me a little bit of hope." Her voice cracked. Then, without another word, she wrapped her arms around him. Not a formal hug, but the surrender of a mother who had run out of strength. Richard didn't pull away. He let her stay there, his hand resting lightly on her back, just as he had rested it on Ethan's in the garden. That evening, when they returned home, Ethan was already sitting outside in the yard, sketch paper spread across the wooden table. He didn't ask anything, just kept drawing with a focus that seemed almost sacred. On the paper was a room, the same familiar label C2, but today the room was no longer dark. A small window had been drawn into the ceiling, letting a shaft of light fall to the center of the floor. And most importantly, there was an open door. Ethan was in the middle of drawing a pair of arms spread wide at the doorframe. He tilted his head and asked, "Do you think if someone was waiting at the door, the person inside would come out?" Richard answered after a moment of quiet. "If that person believes, then yes, and if they step out, they'll see that someone really is waiting." Ethan smiled, a soft but unmistakable smile, like early summer sunlight breaking through thin clouds. Richard didn't ask what color Ethan would use to finish the arms. He just sat beside him silent, looking at the drawing as if it were a memory transformed, not a prison anymore, but a doorway to life. A door that was no longer locked. There are doors that once stood shut in the dark behind silence, behind the fear of children who didn't know they had the right to be loved. But when someone dares to open their heart to believe in the light, miracles can happen. The story of Richard and Ethan is not only about a child being rescued, it is about justice being revealed, about memories being healed, and about a love that doesn't need blood to shelter a life. With the patience and heart of a father, Richard did what an entire system chose to ignore. He listened. And with courage, Ethan turned fear into testimony so that those once forgotten might also find their way back to the light. The guilty were held accountable. The good were finally rewarded. That is not just a happy ending. It is a truth we must hold on to in this world. What did you think of this ending? Have you ever witnessed a small act of kindness that changed someone's life? If you've ever been the one to give or the one to receive, leave a comment below. Every shared story, every feeling you express is a way we can plant more seeds of light together. Are you doing okay? I hope that after hearing this story, your heart feels just a little warmer. Thank you for always being here. See you in the next story.